I'm with Rapyd. I'm the VP of APAC, been here since the first day. I also manage our ventures team globally. I'm also very happy to invite our illustrious panel. First, we have Jason Tan from KPMG from the Financial Crimes Unit. Second, Raymond Huynh from ShopBack, from the risk team. Pohhuat Lee from GoTo, also from risk, and Eran Fishov from Authentics. What have you guys seen in your businesses as things have changed over the last couple of years, and maybe what's the same, and what change do you expect in the future?
I would say when we tackle fraud at ShopBack especially, we sort of bucket it into, I guess you can call it 3 tiers, right? Like you have your sort of amateur fraudsters, very opportunistic fraudsters, then you have sort of your middle tier, and then your highly sophisticated, right? Like people that could potentially get a job elsewhere, but are making much more money from being a fraudster. And what we've seen over this period is we have a very sophisticated stack at ShopBack. I'll just give sort of a high-level example without sort of disclosing too much of our IP, but we have tools that sort of link consumers based off certain attributes, right? So whether that be a common credit card that you utilize, a common mobile phone, IP addresses, any sort of referral linkage, things where we can sort of triangulate clusters of people, and if they're exhibiting different behaviors, we'll be able to track that down. I think during this period of COVID and then into sort of this new year, we're definitely seeing fraudsters that are aware of these mechanics that we have. So they're definitely presenting new mobile phones, new credit cards, things that we can't link them to any sort of cluster, but we definitely know they are part of the same cluster because we obviously utilize Authentics, who are here, for our identity verification, and we can link them on the visual piece. So when they're submitting fake IDs, we can definitely see that they are visually the same person. But it still is very, very sophisticated fraud because in order to generate limitless amounts of credit cards, it still sort of befuddles us as a risk team. What is kind of good for us is we sort of follow the tracks of the very sophisticated fraudsters, continue to build onto our stack, so that if only sophisticated fraudsters get through our stack, then we're pretty much okay. Because largely, people utilizing ShopBack are largely good consumers, and if it's only less than 1% that are fraudulent, we'll be profitable in the long run. So I would say that over the last couple of years, the trends that we see are more sophistication, and it also means that we're having to sort of invest more at ShopBack in terms of our risk stack, and then continue to sort of evolve as we see new trends.
So Simon told us that in 2 different examples that romance fraud were the top 2 categories effectively. What would you consider your top category of fraud, and what's the fraudster doing exactly?
Yeah, I would say right now one of our biggest pain points is synthetic fraud. So very good quality fake IDs. For the crowd that don't really know what ShopBack is about, we're largely an online cashback platform, but we also offer pay and pay later products. And that's to sort of complete the entire user journey for us. So it's your pre-shopping destination all the way through to your post-shopping destination. So synthetic fraud is very high on our list. In order to use our pay products, you do have to provide a form of ID. And it's people having, I guess very sophisticated versions which pass through Authentics or pass through our risk stack that are causing us the most pain. Then I would say second to that is consumers that are sophisticated fraudsters that are very aware of where our loopholes are or where our sort of shortcomings are by continually utilizing our system in programmatic ways.
Good users, so to speak. So Pohhuat, you joined GoTo early on in COVID, so you were a poster child for the transformation. What has GoTo seen as the trends over the last couple of years?
So we primarily operate in Indonesia. It's our main market, right? So what the product that we operate really is e-wallet, right? So we run GoPay, and you can think of it like kind of like the Alipay of Indonesia, right? Or that's what we're trying to build it towards. I think during the COVID period, we did see scam cases increase, right? The storytelling is very varied, right? Meaning that they are selling online game accounts, they are pretending to be merchants, and everyone was stuck, right? And we think that there are two parts of the fraudsters, right? One, unfortunately, just basically kids, right? During the COVID, based on a lot of deep dives and some on-site collaboration that we've done with local law enforcement, we've realized that unfortunately a lot of kids were basically staying at home, were starting to do a lot of dubious stuff, and you can learn a lot of good and bad things over YouTube, etc. And it was driving a rise in scam, right, in that sense. With people going back to school, going back to offices, hanging out with friends, we are seeing it come down, right? So that I would say would be one of the things that we did see come and go with COVID. Apart from that, I think being an e-wallet player, I would say industry normal problem like identity account takeover, how do we minimize our voucher abuse, etc. All those continue, and similarly, I think along the lines of KYC, right? Because Indonesia a very different market, and hence we don't have the benefit of SingPass or anti-scam center.
And Eran, given that you're a technical provider, you want to kind of define what Authentics does and how you've seen the technology change over time?
Yes, thank you. So Authentics is a global identity verification solution, providing global digital verification across the globe. And it's interesting because it actually resonates what the guys over here say, and GoTo and ShopBack. And we've been in the space way before COVID hit the world, and actually goes back almost 40 years ago. And we definitely see a tremendous increase in the amount of fraud is out there. And pretty much resonate with what Raymond said, we see two trends. The first trend is that we do see an increase in the number of attempts to make fraud. But we also see, and this also ties back to what we heard, is that the level of sophistication that those fraudsters are able to achieve is actually going. So they're actually stepping up on the way that the fraud is actually being perceived today. And you could probably see from the opening video that was running on the screen. Did anyone catch the video that was running? It was actually showing as an example how easy is that, allegedly easy, for a fraudster to replicate and create another identity, what Raymond called a synthetic fraud, and actually duplicating a genuine governmental issued ID and replicating it by adding additional information. Some might be real, some might be fake, but creating a new identity. And this is a real threat right now in the world, let alone in the financial service where everything goes digital, everything goes online, inflation grows, but also the financial activity worldwide is growing. And this gives an opportunity for all those fraudsters to come in. And this is to the answer why we see an increase. Yes, it is associated with kids playing around in COVID, but not only. We see even the increase coming from more serious crimes by organized crime and those kind of really well-funded organizations. And that's why the level of sophistication that we see around that is even harder. And if you can play the slide that I have over there, just to give you an example, this is the result of sophisticated fraud, where you can see you take a genuine ID and you actually place the picture very easily. And as a matter of fact, you can place the name, you can place the date of birth, you can place the picture, but there are some elements that the manual verification process, let alone the traditional way of identifying fraud, is failing. And this is those fraudsters. Some of them might be kids, but some of them might be serious fraud, mass production efforts are able to fool the system easily. And this is why we see the trends become hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands in a day. It becomes a serious fraud, and this is where technology is here for help.
So just in the last 6 months, really, we've seen an explosion of visual AI systems. Are you at the point now that you're starting to see things like DALL-E able to create IDs that are real, or has not showed up yet?
So it has shown up. As a matter of fact, the level of sophistication goes far beyond than just the ID, right? Replicating an ID, you just saw did have nowadays a free app like a Photoshop or anything like that, and you can just manipulate it. The level of sophistication goes even far beyond. Nowadays, with free app, and again, we have the police here, so I don't want to imply that we are kind of encouraging anyone to create crime, but it is relatively easy to go ahead and fake your selfie using an app that manipulates your face, let alone a video. So you can fool a video consent or voice consent through a serious app. And this is where the technology is really ending up in order to cope with that. And you have to identify, for example, that there is a malicious deepfake application was used in order to generate this ID or generate this selfie. And this is where we're heading. And this is definitely a huge risk, and where we see that our mission in the world to bring the technology up to speed so you scare off or potentially eliminate those kind of serious frauds that we see out there.
Cool. So Jason, similar, you're also looking at, from a KPMG perspective, across a large landscape. What do you see as kind of that canvas of risk and vulnerabilities these days?
Yeah, so I would say that my fellow panelists have really covered it very well. I recall back in 2016, 2017, when I went to China to work on a project with Fintech, they were doing mobile app onboarding of clients. They were doing selfies. And back then they were saying, they would do a liveness check, right? To your head, wink your eyes, that kind of stuff to make sure that it's not a still photo, right? And this is already 2016/17. You think of it back then as something that is good enough, fit for purpose, and can prevent such impersonation scams from happening. You fast forward a few years, we just talk about deepfake. You look at the deepfake technology now, right now. How do you even combat that? I think, as Simon brought up earlier in the presentation as well, the greatest challenge that we have is that it is a business for the criminals. And it is a business where every money I put in, I expect to get a lot more back. For us, we are playing defense, right? We are a business, yes, but the business has other revenue goals, business objectives. At the same time, we need to protect our consumers. But for them, it's like they're just looking at it as a business standpoint. It's lucrative. They can attract all the talents out there. They can use all this technology that's available. So I just feel that, every single time we're like trying to play catch up, something happens, there's a typology out there, oh, yes, this is happening. Let's look out for other instances of this. It feels like we're never really on top of it, understanding what is the kind of activity that predates or comes before the attack or the scam, to be able to pick it up and try to snuff it off. So I feel that is the challenge, which is technology and digitization, unfortunately. To the extent that if we look at Singapore recently, the local bank, the press, the bad press around them, how some of the consumers got scammed, and the bank had to pay them back the money. We were measuring ourselves by the speed, convenience that we can provide our customers, consumers. Now it's kind of like going a step back. If you are paying money to an unknown beneficiary, you have not paid money to the person before, you're doing through a banking app, they have to only take effect 24 hours later. So they are actually introducing friction into the process. They are trying to slow it down so that there is time for consumers to react. So I would say the speed, which is what the kind of like the key thing that we've all been aiming for all this time to get better at that, has now become something that we need to maybe take a step back and think about how we can control the velocity and try to minimize losses for consumers. So to me, I feel the threat is that the criminals are also getting very sophisticated. They are very organized, and they're putting in good money into their efforts. And that's difficult for us to kind of overleap them and try to be able to stop them before all this happens.
So Pohhuat, he touches on an important consideration, right? How do you trade off your commercial goals as a business with your ability to hit compliance and regulatory and risk goals?
I think regulatory is less of a debate, right, in that sense, meaning that, whatever the regulators have prescribed, we will have to do it, right? It's not even a question, right? I think when you talk about the risk trade-off in terms of friction, right, maybe sometimes it's also less, or at least the way that we're thinking about it is less also about just pure speed and velocity and frictionless, but also who you give frictionless to, right? Because when we go out to understand what our users are trying to, what they expect, right, from a trust and safety and security perspective, sometimes a little bit of friction is what they want, right? Because they feel safer that, for whatever funds that they put in the wallet, if there is no biometric or there's no PIN and, money flows out, they feel unsafe, right? So I think maybe the lens to look at it is less of, frictionless is good, but rather, what does the consumer want and what makes sense to the consumer, and where there is a demand for, a smoother user experience. The question there would be, how good do we know the user, right? Meaning that, is it a new user? I mean, when did they sign up? Is it the same device? Is it the same Wi-Fi? We get all this, right, these days, right? And how do we use that to enable better frictionless to the users that we want, I guess, is the main question. So I guess from our perspective, it is less a trade-off, but rather something of, how do we identify which are the user, which is a typical activity that the user would do, and then, how do we make that frictionless, right, in that sense.
Makes sense. From a ShopBack perspective, how would you say the same thing?
I think Pohhuat hit the nail on the head on a lot of topics, right? Like compliance is obviously non-negotiable. Those are aspects that we definitely have to cover, tick the boxes. There's obviously different levels of interpretation between companies. So like where you see there's a grey area, where you see it's black and white. For the grey areas, obviously, it is driven by commercial, I would say. So like how much friction you introduce, how much you don't introduce. Some of the things that you got to think about from a company perspective is how much leverage or brand power do you have, right? How much brand equity do you have? For ShopBack here in Singapore, we have a pretty strong brand, but when you venture into new markets and you're versing more established players, that's where you have to sort of dive a little bit deeper into the grey areas, right? So like flex on a little bit of friction. Are there better ways for you to sort of assess a consumer and go, I'll prompt these consumers with X friction, but for these ones, I'll prompt less. Those are sort of the considerations that we have to make as a business, because if you do go into a new market and you follow all your compliance requirements, you also then go extreme on the risk side, it's very hard for your business to grow. And we're fortunate that we do have a very strong brand in APAC, but we have these considerations. One of our major competitors on one of our business units, which is Pay Later, obviously you guys know Atomi, they're plastered everywhere. They're kind of our major competitors in that space, and we're constantly trying to battle, like how do we make a user flow more seamless, more user-friendly, but at the same time it's very detrimental on the risk side of things, the more we sort of give up. Because obviously in the back end, when a user makes a transaction, we're doing a number of different models that we're running live. We're synthesizing data points and things like that.
So Eran, if you take kind of both of those points of view commercially and look at it from a customer lifecycle perspective, what is it that you see people doing early on in a customer journey, and how does that change over the course of the journey?
So it's a very good question, because from us as a technology leader, we actually seen kind of evolvement, maturity of this the whole market, and specifically the identity verification space has pretty much shifted the mindset of businesses, where businesses were focused on the KYC, on the onboarding stage, and were pretty much, it was the head of the funnel starting off, and then we started seeing a shift that they evolve into thinking on the ongoing transaction monitoring and applying more verification techniques along the user journey. And as a matter of fact, we started seeing that those businesses that were very much KYC oriented, they now put focus on mapping the touch points, the most crucial touch points of a user journey, and applying the different measures of identity verification at every single point in time. And I'll give an example, is that Normally, a standard KYC would require you like put an ID and governmental issued ID, and then have a selfie to correlate that. And nowadays, once you're into the door, potentially this is where those fraudsters are able to penetrate, and it ends up with account takeover in the withdrawal and in any other touch point. So we start seeing those touch points, and we start seeing identity verification measures implemented, such as you need to put a selfie when you withdraw or when you reset the password, which potentially it's an honest action, allegedly. But if you have fraudsters, the reset password is a very, very sensitive event, because this is where you can catch those kind of fraudsters. So we try to apply, like, you need to prove your address, you need to prove your email once again, or at some point you need to put another verification method in order to ensure that whoever you claim that you were at the beginning when you sign it, is still the same person. And by the way, we see that with kids, stealing their parents' identification, and once they go through another layer of verification, is where they get stuck, and this is where you catch them. So we definitely see those kind of trends coming up.
So as a platform company, right? If I say, you started life providing identity verification as a service, you just used an example of a PIN, which is really more of an authentication or a login capability. Do you see platform companies providing more and more of this basket of different services, or is that something that the client has to assemble themselves?
Well, that's a very good question, because eventually the way we are looking at the market, it's all about orchestrating the flow, right? And one use case is very much different to another use case, and we see that across industries, right? The user journey in an buy now, pay later is very much different in the gaming industry, and therefore, ability for us is to provide this framework, this modular orchestration framework to customers, so they can play around how the measure of risk they want to apply. So we're definitely going towards allowing our customers to play around and tailor the verification techniques in any touch point that they would like, and preferably it will be a self-service, and it will be much easier to comply with regulations, compliance, risk scores, and potential fraudulent attempts that they see as patterns using those techniques.
Jason, is it fair for me to ask how you think your clients are addressing this orchestration problem over the life cycle?
Well, I think if I were to compare, because I'm conscious that everyone here is like from the fintech industry, I think the benefit of coming from the fintech industry is that it's quite new to the scene, in the sense that you don't have structures that have been reviewed for decades and it's difficult to break down, unlike the traditional banks and so on and so forth. So if I can share maybe some of the observations that I've seen, the challenges faced by more traditional FIs, is that they've spent a lot of years trying to build up all the controls and whatnot. They've built up the controls focusing on different elements of things. So if you're talking about money laundering, they have something focusing on AML. You're talking about fraud, then they have another team that looks at fraud. You talk about sanctions, there's another team looking at that. And fraud typically sits under operation risk, which is interestingly not part of compliance per se, but anti-money laundering sits under compliance. If you look at anti-money laundering, what they do is that they also monitor customer transaction activity accounts to see whether there's any unusual things going on. If you look at all the efforts, the know-how, the people they put in to kind of look into that, and you compare that against fraud, it makes perfect sense to kind of look at it together instead of it in silos. So actually, after the recent events in Singapore, some of the banks have actually started to look at combining their fraud team as part of compliance. They're merging it together, looking at together along the likes of AML. Obviously, if you just say I move all these 5 people or 20 people from the fraud team to the AML team, it's going to create magic. That's not going to be true at all. The intent is to leverage on the data, right? Because when you are doing your analysis, you're looking at one set of data. This other side is trying to look at another set of data. But actually, if you combine the data, you put it together, you apply analytics to it, you can actually yield better outcome and results. So they are looking at that as a structural change. And if I think about, what Eran was also sharing, right? And what Simon also mentioned earlier, you think about the job scam. The money comes in, or you pay out the money, they pay you back $10 more. You pay out $200, they pay you $20 more. Actually, they will do a 1 or 2 test transactions so that they can get you to commit to a bigger sum. If you think about that's a trend, that's a pattern, right? That's going to happen. Can we do some machine learning models around that, trying to be able to beat them the next time this happens? We talked about, the verification. I think traditionally a lot of focus has been on KYC, whether there's impersonation. But if we look at all the scams just now, it's not about impersonation. Those are genuine consumers. They were just scam, right? So if we were to just focus on the KYC gate, I feel it's no longer sufficient. There's a need to focus on the subsequent transaction activity and whatnot to detect any unusual behavior. So those are the kind of thoughts that I've gathered from.
Cool, thank you. So Pohhuat, a while ago you made the distinction between the Indonesia market and the Singapore market in terms of things like SingPass. So if you think about eKYC in general and kind of the sophistication of regulatory-driven platforms, are you starting to see the ability to implement more digital eKYC solutions? Are we at that point yet, or is that not really the case in your view?
It is starting, right? So I think there is the equivalent of eKTP in Indonesia. There is, Dukcapil database that, we do ping as well. I think, but those are still, how do I put it? Verifying very basic information, right? That you're not just, creating a string of numbers out of thin air, right? That it matches, right? However, that is that is static, very easily compromised. A lot of friends and family know my, NRIC number, etc. Right? So I think in terms of the first gate, in terms of truly verifying the identity, I think it's combination of a lot of things, right? You cannot just rely on, you ping a government database and you get a yes and, KYC, right? I think it's a lot about, is it a non-live submission? How does your front end and back end liveness match out? What are the signals that come in, right? Because if you think about it, a selfie is a treasure trove of data, right? And, how do you sieve out the signals where it has been Photoshop, it is, has been tampered with, or it's not coming from your own app. There are many of these signals that, you need to sieve out to basically help identify that, beyond just, verifying NRIC matches and, photo matches, that those are where I guess we are kind of like, focused on right now. So I think back to what, the other panelists were saying as well, I think the sophisticated fraudsters have always been there, right? I mean, it is their industry as well. We do also spend time, trying to understand in different Telegram chats and, what exactly fraudsters are doing, right? And yeah, it's amazing. I mean, they are fully competent, highly sophisticated folks, but, that's where the challenge is, right?
Cool, fair enough. From a ShopBack standpoint, you have the privilege of being in Singapore, and I assume having most of your customers here. To what degree are you leaning on the Singapore stack or not?
Yeah, I would say that like a lot of fintech companies, especially in Singapore, are very blessed to be able to leverage SingPass. It's a unified government database. It's basically if you sort of default on a loan with us, we then ban your MyInfo, and I'm pretty sure it's watertight in terms of you can't access another MyInfo. So when I reflect on sort of the MyInfo piece in Singapore, it's so incredibly strong, right? So it removes a huge headache from ShopBack in terms of verifying someone's identity and then making sure that those individuals, if they do default on a loan or commit fraud, that they can't come back into the ecosystem. But what I will say is that, around the globe, the governments are not as mature in terms of that piece. As extreme examples in America, for example, individuals don't even provide their SSN, which is equivalent to sort of your NRIC. So you have huge challenges in the US where there's no sort of central KYC provider, and even if there is, it's really not that great. And then sort of akin to Singapore, Sweden is another very, very strong government provider where they use something called Bank ID. So very akin to MyInfo, it's extremely strong. My thoughts there are that governments that are not at the sophistication of MyInfo and Bank ID will probably take a long time to get there. There's a multitude of hurdles to establish a system that strong. And I think that obviously gives rise to companies like Authentics, where that gap is probably one gap too far to bridge. You have to overhaul a number of different things and then get people to sort of change their perceptions on providing their ID. And that's a clear example in the US where SSNs are very guarded. So I would say that the challenges that are presented to ShopBack in Singapore are limited compared to our other markets, especially if you compare it to markets that we're potentially considering, like Indonesia or Malaysia, Philippines, incredibly tough markets in terms of ID and fraud to tackle.
Fair enough. So just from an audience perspective, by all means, do jump in with any questions. I'm sorry I didn't say that before, but if you have questions or observations for the panelists, we have a tradition of saying things like BS, and you could stick your hand up and assault them. That would be totally fine at this point. So that's there you go, perfect.
And then you've been talking a lot about the sophisticated fraudsters. Is it something very organized? Like, I don't know, maybe like a mafia or like how is it actually working? Because I've come across because I've got my own business, I run it entirely online. So I've come across characters, but I'm just wondering how organized it actually is.
Maybe when I say organized, it's one where the perception that I get is that they run it like a business, right? In that sense. What I mean by that is that, you can buy in bulk, our accounts, right? Someone would create it, KYC it somehow, and they would just sell it in bulk, right? And if you actually go and make the purchase, it's really like a business, right? They take pride, and they are very well organized in that way. So and we see that in many different forms, right? Whether they are just creating accounts and selling it, or whether they are trying to hack our app, or modify our app, or just our APIs. So all these are very I would use the word syndicated, because it seems like that's all they do, and that's how they earn their living, right? In that sense, whether or not they have tattoos everywhere, I'm not sure.
What is it do you guys see outside of your own silos that the community can do to start to fight fraud and identity theft together?
As a matter of fact, we at Authentics, we created and developed a product that specifically addresses that need. It's called Instinct. It allows customers of ours to mutually share with this consortium the ability of patterns of potential fraud, like the ones that we saw on the screen. And they can also mutually benefit from other customers doing the same. And I think that part of the example is that the fact that we're here, we think that for us being a leading solution is not only the best thing we can do, but if we don't share our knowledge, if you don't share the statistics, the insights, the patterns, we say what is organized crime or serious fraud, as we call it, you won't be able to cope with it if you don't hear from the surface how it is, how you guys cope with it, what can we do about that, and eliminate it, nail it on the head step by step. So definitely for us, it's very important to join to those communities, share our thoughts, and collaborate back.
I think commercially we might, have competitors, etc. But I think when it comes to fraud, risk, etc., typically it tends to be a lot easier to share information. There are a lot of small communities, even in Singapore, that we participate in to basically just share, right? Because I guess never know, might spark a certain idea, etc. that would help, right, in that sense.
So we heard a lot about the importance of identifying trends and basically using data. That's a lot easier if you're big. And I guess a lot of people here are quite small. So it sort of links into the community point as to, if you're a small institution, how can you get access to this type of data? What's a sensible step?
It's a great question. It's a great question for you.
Unfortunately, I think at this juncture, given the laws and regulations we have in Singapore, there's a lot of limitations on what kind of data you can share amongst each other. I think it's something that unfortunately possibly have to be dealt at the national level. So Singapore government is coming out with Cosmic, right, which is a platform that allows banks to share suspicious transactions with one another. It will be built by the MAS. It's expected to, I think, roll out sometime next year. I may have gotten the dates wrong, but it starts with a handful of banks, right? The banks with more presence in Singapore, universal banks, but slowly it may open up to other segments if it takes off. So I think that is the right step ahead in that direction, which is about what your earlier point was, sharing all this information with each other. But the problem right now is you have a lot of rules around data privacy and whatnot, so you can't, as individual organizations, do that at this point. The only way I feel it's going to sound cliche is like, you guys are already possibly working with ASC. They are the channel. They are the ones that are able to kind of hold all those information together and try to push out to the rest of everyone. I mean, they have the legal power to do it, right? So that's probably the fix right now, if you think about it. But long term, maybe, at the national level, hopefully one day, we will have a platform where everyone can go in and provide information on suspicious transaction is secured, and other people can go in and access that information as well on a secure basis. And with that information sharing, then I think it will really help.
Raymond, would you suggest that using third-party platforms as a way to kind of jumpstart scale and get the benefit of it from a third-party platform's existing customer base?
Yeah, I think it would come down to sort of what are your problem statements? What are you trying to tackle? Definitely for a brand new company, you can only learn by acquiring data. So whether that is, sort of trading through, collecting that data, but obviously along the way you'll take a lot of losses, or tapping into third party. I think there's a lot of good sources out there. I don't have to name drop. I think if you can Google, Grab Defense is one, right? They've opened up a lot of their data and a lot of what they're doing to the public. That's provided you want to share more data to Grab. That's up to you. And then there's a number of different sort of third-party providers to tap into to sort of kickstart your journey. And then based off the data that you then collect, you can then perhaps transform and train your own models.
How do you protect the information, and what sort of security measures have you put in place to retain the confidentiality?
So first of all, we've been working in this space for 40 years. The company was established, surprisingly or not, we started with the passport verification at airports. Back then, pre-COVID, you would go to the airport, you scan your passport. That was the company was doing, so very much secure. Pre-GDPR, all the data is secured. And then when we leveraged that to the identity verification, securing documents like ID, governmental issued IDs like passports, driving license, for us, we kept the same measurements as we kept back then when we were verifying passports. So PII information is key. We do not save the PII on our side. As a matter of fact, the instinct, like the synthetic fraud, is that we don't save any of this information. We just hash it in a mathematical algorithm on our side, and that we are able to detect whether we have a repetition of that pattern. And this allows us to identify whether there are patterns repetitive across the same use case, across different customers. We do not save the PII. And we've been audited on a very, very frequent basis because we work with global challenger banks, financial services, gaming, gamification. All industries are under huge regulation and compliances. And yes, we are SOC 2 compliance, GDPR, PCI, so we have all the relevant compliance, but it's really top of our mind to ensure that no data is saved. And really, this is the only way we can identify, and I circle back to what was discussed about insights. What we do is that we don't take the PII, we don't need to share a document, a picture of someone. We just share the insights, we share the trends. And by the way, we do that across our customers based on a frequent basis. This is a mass synthetic fraud we saw, and we see an increase in Turkey over Q4, potentially because of some currency change. But this is where we see where it varies between an individual, a kid playing role versus a mass organized crime, if you will, is doing in mass production of hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands a day. So we don't keep the data, but we keep the insights in order to share that. And this is how we actually make the outcome and the insights, how you go about that.
Eran, you showed us the that slide previously with those changing faces, etc. But I mean, can you just educate us more about synthetic fraud? I mean, what else constitutes that? Maybe the other panelists have a point of view, just in terms of what's emerging, what's out there.
So it's actually funny. I mean, I think Jason mentioned that it's kind of, you always ahead, right? You're in defensive mode, right? And the defensive mode comes because we're trying to overcome the fraudsters. But if you use old traditional classic models of fraud prevention, which is putting an agent in front of the computer, looking at the picture, looking at a selfie, and allegedly you're supposed to match them up, there's so much behind that. There's so much technology around that, because it's not only which template they use, right? The images you saw just happens to be a template available online, and guess what? There are some certain countries that their template of passport is available out there. It doesn't mean that these people are fraudsters or a particular country is more fraudulent than the other. It's just a matter of where they exist. So what we see, back to your question, we see a trend where we match between the ID that was put up, the template, versus the physical location. And you see amazing correlation between fraudulent countries. Again, I don't name any countries to make someone feel in the bad, but it's not necessarily the same country where the passport is coming from. And you start correlating that, and at the same time you see the same ID, the same photo, but in a different part of the world. Now, there are some people who may be able to do that, but not when it happens hundreds, thousands, and tens thousands within the same day. So you actually correlate those information. Use the camera. I think, Jason, you mentioned as well. If someone is using a malicious software that takes over the camera, an agent cannot do that. Only machine that knows how to identify that there is a malicious software installed, Photoshop, I don't want to drop the name of the other tools that do that, but actually take over the camera. Machine is doing that. And this is why the nice stuff that we see, we are the good cops in that sense. We measure a lot of serious fraud or organized crime fraud. And think about that every user like that may be generating a few bucks, sometimes hundreds of bucks with buy now, pay later, or in cryptocurrencies. We're talking about millions and trillions of dollars scattered all over, and most of them, and you'll be surprised to hear, that 80 to 90% of the synthetic fraud worldwide are uncaught because those acts act like regular users. They use genuine governmental issued ID, and they act like players until they act. And when they act, they withdraw, they change the account, and then we see them as transaction loss. And this is why, tying back to your question, we see a whole very serious fraud out there, and the technology allows you to pinpoint and find those signals ahead of the game, before they cash out, before they withdraw the money, and before you get a refund the honest person that his identity was stolen, allegedly.
Thanks very much. Sure. And thanks for the questions. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance. We have a lot of food to eat. We have some alcohol and some non-alcoholic beverages to drink, so please help us out with both of those things. And we look forward to chatting to you now. Thanks very much.